Welcome everyone to IsisParenting's Sleep Support Webinar and Chat. My name is Nancy Holtzman. I'm a mom and baby nurse educator, board certified lactation consultant, and board certified in pediatrics. I am the Vice President of Clinical Content and Online Learning here at IsisParenting. I'm sitting outside of Boston, Massachusetts at our home office in Needham. We have 4 centers in the Metro Boston area. We have 5 brand new beautiful centers in Dallas and Fort Worth regions, as well as 4 glorious new centers in the Atlanta, Georgia area. Our centers outside of Massachusetts are located nested within Babies R Us. So if you have friends or family who live in Massachusetts, Atlanta, or the Dallas area, please let them know to come and visit us at ISIS. And if you're not local, that's okay, because we're here online for you every Tuesday with our sleep webinars and every Thursday with our breastfeeding and pumping webinars, and then intermittently with all kinds of other online offerings. So today we are going to get started right away talking about the daylight savings time change, and the fall is when we turn our clocks back an hour. And you may be wondering why that might be a hard change for some babies and toddlers. And my friend and colleague Meg Casano is going to tell you why daylight savings can become an issue and what are some things you can do ahead of time to get yourself and your baby or toddler on a slow plan for adjustment so that you don't have too many 4:30 a.m. wake-up calls. Hi, Meg.
Hi, Nancy. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Those of you who know my voice very well, I'm sorry, it sounds a little funny because I had some dental work today, so just ignore. Okay, we're going to jump right in. So as Nancy kind of alluded to, the end of daylight savings time, what's the big deal? And you might think back to your days in college or when you were working and you didn't have kids and you were like, oh, great, the fall daylight savings, I can sleep in for an extra hour, right? But the problem with daylight savings for lots of babies is that it's requiring the body to shift by more than 1 hour. In order to keep your baby's schedule following the new clock time, your baby's body has to shift greater than 1 hour. And the biological clock, or the circadian rhythm, doesn't generally handle shifts greater than 30 minutes all in one time. That becomes like time zone travel, right? It's like flying to the Midwest and expecting your baby to go to sleep at their usual time or wake up at their usual time. It takes a few days for that to get sorted out. So if you sort of think about daylight savings time as time zone travel, then it helps you have a better understanding of why this can be problematic. And so here's another way I like to sort of explain it. You want to kind of stop and think for a second. In the fall, we're going to set our clocks backwards by 1 hour. And if you think about what that means in terms of your baby, if your baby has been falling asleep at 7 p.m., if you do nothing and we change our clocks back by an hour, your baby will want to fall asleep at 6 p.m., right? And in the morning, if your baby's been waking up at, say, 6 a.m., if you do nothing, your baby will want to wake up at 5 a.m., And so as you go through daylight savings time, your baby's body hasn't done anything different. It's still waking up at the time it always has, right? It's just that because the clocks have changed, now the clock time says something different. So if you'd like your baby's schedule to stay, your baby's biological schedule, to match the new clock schedule, what you need to do is actually shift your baby's schedule 1 hour later. And that's what we're going to talk about today. You're shifting your baby's whole schedule, bedtime and wake time, 1 hour later, so that when we shift our clocks backwards, everything still matches up the way you're used to. The problem is not so much the bedtime when you're going to do this, right? If you're going to be shifting your baby's schedule later, you're asking him to stay up later, and we're going to talk through that step by step. Staying up later is usually easier, especially for older babies who can withstand greater amounts of sleep pressure. That's how tired they are. So that can be easy, but the problem is the mornings. Mornings tend to take several days to rebound. And so if you try to just, say, oh, that's no big deal, I'm just going to put my baby to bed an hour later on that first night, chances are he's still going to wake up at his usual time. And now all you've done is shortchanged him by an hour of sleep that night. So taking some preparation steps is actually really helpful because it does take several days for the body clock to readjust. And also when you're talking about those early morning hours, remember, that's the time of night where your baby's drive for sleep. The sleep pressure is the lowest. It's a different type of sleep. Your baby's threshold for arousal is much lower, so little noises can all be very stimulating and cause your baby to wake out of sleep much earlier. Okay, so we are talking about babies who are really over the 4-month mark. And that's because for babies who are under 4 months, particularly newborns in the 3-month range too, they're not as affected by the body clock, the exposure to light and dark. Their circadian rhythms are still in development. And so really what this webinar is for babies who are over 4 months. We're also talking about mostly toddlers who are under 2 years. And because that's when your child gets to be over 2 years, 2.5, 3 years old, again, they just tend to be able to handle the shift better, like you or I would. You kind of go through it and it takes a few days, but it's not that big a deal. And if you're a little overtired, you catch up because you take a little longer nap. And, it's just not that big a deal. So don't overthink this. I mean, as I'm going through step by step, I don't want you to get too stressed about this. Even if you do nothing, your baby will still make the shift. Might be a little more rocky. And if you do nothing and your baby doesn't make the shift, well, you can always call us for a sleep consult and we'll help you through that too. But I don't want you to get too stressed out about the time change because I know some people do, and you'll be fine. Don't worry. Okay, so how are you going to do this? Basically, this is going to amount to, over the course of 1 week, you're adding an extra hour of light exposure in the evening. And by light, we mean really bright light. I mean, one of the reasons why sometimes babies don't make the shift is because even though their parents are like, oh, well, I kept them up later, but if your house lights aren't bright, then it might not be enough light to cause the shift to take place. Okay, so what you'll start to do is slowly, in about 15-minute increments, every couple of days. This is the week leading up to daylight savings time. You're making a general shift of your baby's bedtime later. Now, I say 15 minutes, but most babies' bedtimes aren't to the minute exact. In fact, we encourage having kind of a 30-minute window of the time when your baby's going to bed each night. So don't feel like, oh, well, if she went to bed at 7 o'clock last night, she has to go to bed at 7:15 the next night, and it has to be 7:30 the next night. It doesn't have to be that exact. You're sort of looking for a general pattern. Over the course of a week, you're shifting your baby's bedtime 1 hour later, which amounts to approximately 15 minutes every couple of nights. And with that, you are also making sure that your lights in your house are on bright. Okay, you can even go like run an errand to Target or a convenience store, which would have super bright overhead lights, and that can help the shift as well. Again, older toddlers, preschoolers, their schedules may shift more quickly with that evening light exposure. Okay, step 2, as important, if not more important, is the extension of morning darkness. This is kind of the key to making the shift happen. Well, I shouldn't say the key, because the evening light is important too, but the morning darkness, you want to extend your baby's exposure to darkness in the morning. In a perfect world, I would say, okay, so when your baby wakes up at their usual time, remember, we're talking about the week preceding the time zone shift, your baby is still allowed to get up at their usual time. And we don't expect this to happen in one night. So you still get your baby up. Let's say your baby's waking up at 6:30 a.m. Your baby still wakes up. But instead of turning on lights, turning on screens, playing, you're going to try to keep it kind of dark. and calm and boring. Again, in a perfect world, you would stay in dark, like really dark, like no light, for a full hour. You could be interacting with your baby. You could be, singing quiet songs. You could be doing some quiet play. I know it's hard to really do a whole lot in the dark. That would be a perfect world, kind of the full 60 minutes of darkness. If you can't do that because of your work schedules or other children's schedules, I mean, believe me, I know how that is. Do as much as you can. Even if you can do 30 minutes now before the time shift, and then maybe you do the remaining 30 after the time shift, that's fine too. Do the best you can. But morning darkness exposure is a really important part of making it through daylight savings time with your desired wake up time intact. Okay, generally it will take several days, 3 to 5 days even, for your baby's morning wake up time to start to rebound. An alternate plan here, if you're feeling like you might need a little bit more time to work on this, and this is actually what I'm going to start trying to do with my kids, would be before you start shifting your child's bedtime, you would first expose them to that additional darkness in the morning. So you still go to bed at your normal time, you still get up at your normal time, but you try to keep things quiet, calm, boring, keep it a little dark. Like my husband and I might go get into our kids' beds in the morning. We might let them come into our beds in the morning. We keep the lights off. We play, we talk, we snuggle, and we might just do that for half an hour before we get up and start our day. We'll do that for a few days, and then we'll start to shift their bedtimes later. And so you've sort of given your child's circadian rhythm a little boost, a little prep work before you actually begin trying to move the timing of their bed and wake time. Hopefully that made sense. Any questions like specifically about this slide as they're coming up, just type them in. Okay. So now what you're going to do is you're going to repeat step 1 and step 2, evening light exposure, slightly later bedtime, morning darkness exposure. You're going to repeat these steps over the course of the week or so leading up to daylight savings time, so that your child makes the shift. Ultimately, in the end, if you think about it, like in the night before daylight savings time, you might actually be putting your child to bed later than you, maybe even later than you ever have. But the next morning, they're sleeping in later than they ever have. But then the next night, when we shift our clocks, it's kind of back to normal. Hopefully that makes sense. It can be a little confusing. You kind of just stop, think about it for a second, and remember too that your best friends in the morning are darkness. Your baby's room has to be really dark. It has to be cool. Your baby's not overbundled, not overheating. So, now it's getting to be winter. Check your timers on your heaters. If they're clicking on at 5:30 and jumping your baby's room up 6 degrees, that could be a problem. So double check the timing of your heaters. Make sure you've got a great white noise machine running that, like the Dome Sleepmate, can stay on all night. It's not going to shut off. Make sure you've got a cool mist humidifier if you've got dry air in your house, so your baby's nose and all that isn't bothering them as well. Okay, and then be patient, because it can take several days, especially if your baby's in that kind of 4-month to 2-year mark. It can take you several days to make the shift. If you have an older child, they will probably sail through this more easily. Younger babies won't be as affected. So if you're falling somewhere in the middle, just be a little patient, allow for some time to shift. And then, of course, if you find it's not happening and you need more one-on-one advice, then we can always walk you through that as well.
Great. So there were a few questions in the chat room and coming in the Q&A box about room temperature and the climate and what to dress babies in seasonally. And of course, we try to stay away from saying room temperatures. So many people would say about 64 to 72 degrees would be an appropriate room temperature. And we could say that, but that's really only half the story, because what you dress your child in plays a lot into how warm or cool they're going to be despite the room temperature. So if you have the room temperature at 70, which seems reasonable, but then you overbundle your baby in 3 different heavy layers of sleepwear, they're going to overheat, even though the room is not too warm. But 3 layers of warm clothing may be appropriate if you live in a drafty old Victorian house and you keep it heated to 65 degrees. Then they may need cooler, warmer clothing when they're sleeping. Remember that the extremities, like the hands, the ears, the nose, may feel cool to the touch, especially in the winter. But if you slip your hand under their shirt front, if their chest and tummy feel warm, they're warm enough. And that you may expect cool hands, but you do want warm feet. So if they are not in a sleep sack or footed pajamas, then you do want to put some socks on your baby. Keep their feet warm when they're sleeping. And in terms of when to switch the material for your sleep sack, again, a sleep sack is a great idea because it is a wearable blanket, and babies move around quite a bit at night. It won't stay tucked under a blanket necessarily. So that is a safe and warm option, and they do come in lightweight cotton to thick, I don't know what you call that, velour, or fleece, and so you can find something that's the right weight for your room temperature, and then dress the baby appropriately underneath it, which may be lightweight cotton pajamas, or it might even be a sweatsuit if your house is chilly. Okay, here's a question, Meg, from a mom with twins, and let's see, let me move it to another window so I can read it better. Okay, so they say that they usually give a bottle upon waking up. So in the event of trying to keep the baby in the darkness in the morning, should they cuddle in their bed with them for 30 minutes before feeding? Or would you suggest giving the bottle in darkness? So how does feeding, when the baby wakes up in the morning and you're trying to kind of shift their sleeping patterns, what would you do about feeding?
Yeah, you know what? I'm so glad she asked that, because as I was going through this, I was like, oh, I think we did this last year. We left out the soundbite about feeding, and then we circled back to it. And as I'm going through that, I'm like, talk about feeding. And then I knew there was something on the tip of my tongue, so that's an awesome question. That's really important. The feeding, so just like a morning light cue, a morning feeding cue can also perpetuate a wake up, right? If your baby's tummy is used to digesting milk at 6 a.m. every day, that becomes very habitual. And so now when we set the clocks, well, guess what? Even if it's dark, if your baby's tummy is rumbling at 5, he's still up looking to drink his milk. So yes, you're absolutely right. As you are extending your baby's darkness exposure in the morning, in that week leading up to daylight savings time, you are also trying to delay the morning feeding as well. You don't have to do it by half an hour at once, and I'm not even going to say, oh, it has to be 10 minutes a morning. I mean, sure, you could sort of have that be your goal. Like, let me try to hold him off for 10 minutes every morning for a week, and at the end of the week, you've shifted his feeding an hour later. So yeah, you're basically, over the course of a week, try to shift that feeding, that morning feeding, 1 hour later, so that when we set our clocks back, the feeding time by the clock is right where it always has been. Great question.
Great. Here's Nancy, a related question from a mom who says her baby...
Go ahead. I was going to add, there were a couple questions about the early morning that I wanted to touch on too, if we have time.
Right, that might be this one. This mom already has an early rising baby, and she says she's watching the webinars. She's watched the 2 early morning wake ups webinar, and she's been working on darkness in the morning, but says that her little one will just hang out in the dark and chat, and it doesn't seem to bother him, which is fine. It's not supposed to bother him. But then she says, do I just have an early riser that doesn't like to sleep? So then I wondered, well, when do you start taking into account whether it's a daylight savings or just the run-of-the-mill 5 a.m. morning wake-up baby, and start looking at the expectations for nighttime sleep. Are we expecting the baby, if the baby's going, down for sleep at 7 p.m., is it an unrealistic expectation to expect him to sleep much past 5 or 5:30? Or what about, daytime nap times and so on? Like, when do you begin to wonder if an early morning waking is because the baby has pretty much had all of the nighttime sleep he's going to need or get, and so you need to start shifting your bedtime?
Yeah, right. And I think there was a question in the chat too that said that a mom said, I've already been shifting my baby's bedtime, but the morning wake time isn't reflecting that. So, and we actually talked about this on our team call last night, that, yeah, you sometimes have to bring other factors into consideration. I mean, this specifically was just about the daylight savings time, but if you're already dealing with a too early wake up, yes, looking at the early morning webinar is a good place to start. You have to examine your baby's schedule carefully and make sure you're allowing your baby's sleep needs to change as they grow and get older, that you're not expecting too much sleep. So make sure that, even though you might want your baby to do 11 and a half hours at night and 3 hours during the day, they might be just fine with 2.5 hours during the day and 10.5 to 11 at night. I mean, so you do want to make sure that your sleep is appropriately dispersed throughout the day. Naps are happening with the right timing, that your ratio, sort of your window between last nap and bedtime is appropriate, so that your baby is rebuilding enough sleep pressure to cause them to help them sustain their sleep through the night. So all of that, the whole schedule stuff, the whole environment stuff, it sounds like this mom is kind of on it. And then sometimes it is light. I mean, if you've been putting your child to bed later in the evening, but the lights haven't been on bright, that can cause the schedule to keep lagging, right? That's, so if you feel like, no, I know this is really what I need to do, we're shifting the bedtime later, and we really need the morning to push out later, as well, try doing something like doing an errand at Target in the evening where the lights are super ultra bright, much brighter than your house lights. And see if you can sort of help force shift the schedule that way, if you feel like your house lighting might be a little bit too dim. And so if you are sort of, you're going through, you're checking all the boxes, right? You're making sure, okay, I've done everything. I've given it enough time to sit in. Some babies just are early risers. And sometimes, we say, okay, well, if your baby is just one of those babies who really wants to wake early, and you've done everything you possibly can, then you may have to actually look back at, okay, well, have I now shortened his night too much? And actually, if I just embrace the early wake up, back the bedtime earlier again, we get back to a nice long sleep. Even though it's early, I know it's not going to be forever, and we can live with it. So I think that was sort of a long way of saying there are probably some more things this mom could try and that we could tease out for her to be working on. But yes, some babies are early risers, although it takes a while before I would actually come right out and say that.
Okay. And I think we were reading some research maybe 6 months ago that says that some of that actually may be hereditary, and not even necessarily environmental from what the parents are doing and how they keep their home activity, but actually genetic. So that's interesting. Okay, here's a question that someone asked last week. Two related questions from that were repeated from last week. We didn't get to them. And these questions are about their babies who wake up. So one mom says that her baby almost always wakes up crying. And another mom says that her baby wakes up and just sits or plays or is quiet. And so she wouldn't even know her baby was awake after a nap or in the morning unless she saw him on the monitor. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about transition states and how some babies wake or transition from one state to another, and what would you do in either of those situations?
Okay, sure. So for the baby who wakes up and kind of hangs out, I guess I would look a little bit at how the baby learned to do that in the first place, which is sort of a natural thing that he just kind of did, or was this a result of some sort of sleep intervention, probably something more restrictive and structured that sort of taught him to, just hang out and wait for mom. So I would be curious to know if any, what else was going on in this equation. But it's just sort of a natural, baby just kind of chill, has that personality, and wakes up happy. Then you would just want to be careful that you're not getting into a too long in the crib scenario. Like some parents will say, oh, well, as long as he's happy, I'm not going to go get him. And so they wait until he starts to fuss. And then, of course, you don't want your baby to think that he has to fuss for you to come and get him. So, you might set an alarm because if you're sleeping through until your baby starts to cry, make sure you're kind of getting your baby up and out of the crib within about the same 30-minute window every morning. And be sure that if your baby is one of those babies who hangs out happily, you'll probably want to keep an eye on the monitor as it's getting to be the end of his normal nap or night sleep time, so that you can get him before he becomes unhappy. So that's that. And then for the baby who wakes up crying, again, I would look at how the baby's going down in the first place. Does baby feel like he's been baited and switched a little bit in the night? Like, was he rocked or snuggled or nursed to sleep? And then when he wakes up, that's all gone. Sometimes that could cause some of the crying. If baby is being rocked, or if baby is going to bed on his own, or what seems to be on his own, if it's a time when sleep pressure is really, really high, and it's kind of easy to fall asleep, that's different than, say, between sleep cycles of a nap or in the early morning when it's harder to fall asleep. And so it could be that your baby knows how to go to bed at nap time or bedtime when it's kind of easy, but needs a little help, needs maybe a little bit of sleep intervention when it's a little harder to, so that he's not crying and upset about that. And some people will say, oh, well, if they wake up crying, it means they're not rested, or they need more sleep. That's really not that's not a fail-safe. I mean, sure, that could be true sometimes, but that's not exactly an equation that you would want to go by. So look more at what kind of sleep your baby is getting overall. Sometimes the crying, it depends on the time of night that it's happening. It could mean things like sleep inertia or overtiredness, even night terrors or nightmares, but I don't, that's kind of another separate topic. In any case, I don't consider either scenario a huge problem per se. I mean, it's not like dinging bells or raising red flags in my mind, more just that take a look at your baby's sleep associations, keep them really positive, make sure you're not expecting too much sleep. And again, like with so many of these things, we could tease out so much more in an individual call, but hopefully hopefully that's enough to kind of give them some tips to get started.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. I think we have time. I just had to put Brooke's picture up there. I think we have time for one more quick question. And by the way, I discovered that this little guy, Brooks, our friend, is about to turn 1 already. I can't believe it. So a question that is near and dear to my heart. How would you suggest a mom manage the baby who wakes up typically between 5 or 6 a.m. and within an hour to an hour and a half is ready for the first nap of the day, which in my experience, both personally and working with moms and babies, that's pretty typical for the young baby, that the first morning nap of the day typically is the most predictable one, falls into place first, but also may occur an hour to an hour and a half or two after the baby wakes up for the day. And so mom is just, barely waking up, starting her coffee, the sun is barely up, and the baby's already down for the first nap. So when is a morning nap versus an extension of nighttime sleep with an extended wake period in the middle?
Yeah, you're asking me hard questions today, Nancy. What's going on?
Well, there's not a lot of questions in the Q&A box, so I'm thinking of things that people asked last week, and this was in the chat room. General question. I'm challenging you, Meg.
I know. So that would depend a bit on the age of the baby, and how much sleep pressure they could and should withstand in the morning. and what their sleep schedule should be doing at the age they are at. I mean, for a little baby, yeah, it might be 45 to, an hour and 15 minutes before baby's ready to go back to sleep for a newborn. But as you move past the 4-month mark, you do want to be seeing that first napping window be extending up to about the 2-hour mark as you get to about 4 months. And by the time you get to 6 months, it might even be 2.5 hours of wakefulness before your baby's ready for bed. If you're stuck in a newborn rut, like you've got a 5-month-old who keeps going back down for a nap an hour and 15 or an hour and a half after wake up, then yeah, you could be looking at naps happening too close to morning wake up time could be transferring from them of that night's sleep, could also be setting you up for a 4-nap situation or mini nap situation, which won't be quite as restorative as the longer naps. Not sure if this is what you wanted me to get at, Nancy, but it would be a little baby dependent and age dependent, and also I'd be looking at kind of what the baby's doing overnight as well, to make sure there wouldn't be anything going on with their circadian rhythm because of what's happening overnight.
Yep. No, that is exactly what I was wondering. And parents always they wish they could combine that first nap and make that an extension of nighttime sleep, but no, it's unfortunately rarely possible to do that. All right, well, it is after 12:30, so we do need to wrap up. So I have a few quick announcements. I'm not kidding, people. If you haven't gone over to our Facebook page, please use this link, click it, and like ISIS on Facebook. I would appreciate that. And you can follow myself and ISIS on Twitter if you would like. Please sign up for our weekly age-by-stage-based newsletter, which runs from the 6th week of pregnancy through the 3rd birthday. And please stay tuned for the Sleep Online e-class, which will be released sometime in the next 2 weeks, and to time with daylight savings. And that is a fine piece of workmanship from Meg herself right here, and Erin Flynn Evans, who is the other co-sleep team leader, and Teresa, who manages the sleep program, and myself contributed several chapters. So this is an online class that will be available, and it covers the age group birth to 1 year. So please help us spread the word with expecting friends that you have and people with brand new babies. And we do cover a lot of sleep interventions that we don't generally go over in the webinars. And so I think even for people that have 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 month olds, there's a lot of juicy content here that you are not getting on the webinars that you will get in the e-class. All right, have a wonderful week. Meg, thank you so much for getting people some help with preparing ahead for daylight savings. Join me on Thursday for our breastfeeding and pumping webinar, which will be all Q&A this week. I don't think we need to get our breasts ready for daylight savings, so we'll just take general questions. And join us back next week for our sleep webinar. Have a healthy, happy week and safe sleep.
Thanks, everyone.